Thank you, Andrew. Our next reader is Susan A. Phillips. She's an assistant professor of environmental analysis at Pitzer College. She is the author of Wall Bangin', Graffiti and Gangs in LA, also published by the University of Chicago Press. This is what Tom Hayden had to say about her book. Susan A. Phillips' book should be required reading for every proponent of the wars on drugs and gangs who may be entertaining second thoughts of what they have wrought. She illuminates evidence that the wars may be self-justifying and self-perpetuating. The blunt questions are whether turning undervalued human beings into high-value targets for police and prosecutors only creates a vacuum to be filled by vengeance, and whether demonizing only assures the further rise of demons. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Susan A. Phillips.
Thank you very much. What I wanted to do today is exactly the opposite of what Andrew did, and that was great. And actually, I'm really excited that there are a lot of intersections between his work and mine in terms of issues of demographic change and also dealing with the issue of drugs and gangs in communities, which is essentially some of the main themes of my book. So thank you all so much for being here in Skylight. I wanted to say that yes, so some of you already knew, even before Noelle said it, that I had written this previous book about gang graffiti. And like any good project, this one kind of spun out of that one. And I made a very good friend during the course of that writing that then kind of became an anchor for me in the neighborhoods where I was working. And I started working in 1995 in the Pueblo del Rio neighborhood, and in the historic part of what we used to call South Central LA. And now there's all kinds of different names for it, South LA and historic South Central. But this is basically the 50s blocks between Central Avenue and Alameda. And so, you know, being a white girl and being in what were then very already mixed African-American Latino neighborhoods, it was nice for me to have someone who accepted me into his family and into his life, and who created the possibility for me to do this work. And he was in prison most of the time that I knew him, and eventually was released, and then died in 2008 in a gang-related killing. He was killed. But I wanted to mention him here because what happened in that instance is that I published this book in '99, and then I was doing all this work, and I was feeling like I was an anthropologist, ethnographer, and I kind of wanted to write this book about the neighborhood, and I just could never really figure out what to do with it. You know, I had a bunch of stories, I knew a bunch of people, I was like, maybe write about these people's lives, you know, and just talk about the neighborhood and its history and all the people that have died, and sort of death and mourning issues were really key at the time. And it was pretty vague, honestly, and I just was sort of aimlessly, I mean, you're never aimless if you have a real connection to people, and I felt that real connection. But in terms of focusing it into a book, I honestly didn't know what to do about it until 9 years ago yesterday, when he got caught up in this sweep and was arrested along with 28 other people on June 26, 2003. In this task force called Operation Flytrap. And so when that happened, basically I watched his family just crumble, like his family just shattered. His mother was facing eviction proceedings from public housing because of it. His little brother started flipping off cops every time he saw them in the neighborhood. He had been taken out at gunpoint in his underwear. He was 12, mistaken for a suspect. His wife was arrested and lost her job. She was without income for 8 months. She was arrested and wasn't ever held. There was child social services involved. So there was a lot of anxiety on the part of the family. And here my friend Ben was peripheral. to this case. He was a state target, he wasn't even in the federal conspiracies, and there were all these people at the center of the case. There were 28 other people, and I thought, my God, if this is happening to his family, you know, what is happening to the other 28 families? You know, like, so that's what started the project for me, was this idea of family dissolution. And I started writing to the people who had been detained in the case and sort of asking them, like, what happened to you? What happened to your family after these arrests? And what happened was a couple people responded. They self-selected. A lot of people were very suspicious. If you can imagine, in the wake of an FBI-led sting sweep operation, you know, the anthropologist is not like the first person you want to turn to with a major trust. So I was lucky, though, in that the people who did respond to me were the people at the center of the case. So the most important people in the case happened to be the ones to return my letters that I wrote to them in prison. And it helped me that I knew people that they knew. Like, I had experience in the neighborhood. I knew people that they used to get high with. I knew people that they used to be prostitutes with or sell drugs with. Like, I knew the neighborhoods, and I knew the landscape, and I knew my friend Ben. So that's how the whole thing got started. And it began to sort of really be shaped by more. I realized that the story of family dissolution was just one part of the story. And what came out of it in the end was my desire to change the way we talk about crime and change the way that we talk about criminal justice, and to kind of change the rhythm of what that conversation looks like, because all you guys ever hear about are these moments of apprehension, 28 people arrested in an early morning raid, that story, and then you might hear the story about people being sentenced to 27 years, 25 years, 22 years. You may hear that story a couple years later. So those are the two places where publicity sets our gaze, and I really wanted to shift that and set our gaze somewhere else. And I wanted to write the story of this case from sort of surveillance to sentencing, and talk about the contexts that give rise to crime, including things that stretch far beyond the control of any neighborhood residents, like changes in the political economy, changes in our educational system, like really broad things, including demographic shifts. And then I also wanted to write about the consequences of the suppression of crime, which is also something that the public never hears about. So my interest was in shifting into a different rhythm and using people's stories and the people at the center of this case, their stories, their life histories, and their ongoing struggles to kind of frame and reframe the concept of criminal justice into a conversation that also included elements of social justice. And so that's really the goal of the work. And I wanted to read to you the first 4 or so pages. And then I'll give you a brief kind of, just snapshot of what the book is about, like what it is that we talk about in here in my chapters. And then open up for questions for Andrew and me. And I wanted to start with the very beginning introduction of the book, which starts with a woman who is at the center of the case, Tina Fly, and beginning with her list of aliases. That is in one of the federal, police and law enforcement documents. Okay, Charlotte Venia Jackson, AKA Charlotte Renee Jackson, Charlotte Tina Jackson, Charlotte Venda Jackson, Tina Jackson, Nick Janae Holmes, Charlotte Ventra Jackson, Renata Johnson, Charlotte Vina Jackson, Rick, and this is the grandchild. It's okay. This is the grandchild here of Charlotte, of Rickney Holmes, Nikki Jones, Renata Carlette Johnson, Renata C. Jackson, Renata Carlotte Johnson, Renata Charlotte Johnson, Charlotte Venia Jackson, Nick Janae Holmes, and Tina Fly. And this is Tina Fly's grandbaby, Denim. Okay. When Tina Fly was 8 years old, she put a firecracker in a classmate's ear. Tina was a nearly illiterate child. The incessant teasing by other students compounded her behavioral problems. like the firecracker incident, and eventually she was put in special classes. Her mother, Jenia Jackson, remembers a doctor prescribing Ritalin for Tina when she was 9, which was the beginning of trips to the psychologist and physician. Tina attempted suicide at 14. She afterwards cycled through mental hospitals and treatment centers throughout South Los Angeles and Watts. She was diagnosed alternately with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, depression, and much later, borderline mental retardation. She claimed she sometimes heard the voice of her father telling her to kill herself, or contrarily, to be strong. She was a lesbian lover of Linda Bear, a Flytrap target dubbed Black, and Crystal, a half-black, half-Mexican crack addict who eventually became Confidential Source 1. Tina met John Edwards, or Jr., at 16, and shortly thereafter became pregnant with Tawana, the eldest of her 2 daughters. Jr. was her first real romance, and remains the man she describes as the love of her life. In adulthood, they became crimies, partners in crime, but as teens, they were embroiled in attraction and dependence. Before Flytrap, Jr.'s only violent criminal charge was related to domestic violence against Tina. When he found out that Tina had lied by telling him he was the father of her next child, Joanna, he didn't care. He continued to provide help for the girl, another challenged child, who with her grandmother's aid eventually graduated from high school. Every time Tina was incarcerated, authorities medicated her. At 20, she began the crack abuse that would last for the next 2 decades. No trauma or life-changing event drove her to her addiction. When a friend gave her the first hit, she wanted more. In the mid-1990s, Tina became a prostitute to support her habit. She did demoralizing things on crack, she says, that she never would have done otherwise. She left her kids with her mother and ran wild on Central Avenue. When the FBI arrested and charged Tina in 2003, she had no technical grounds on which to base an insanity plea, but the court psychologist suggested that the judge take her poor impulse control and susceptibility to manipulation into account during sentencing. She had, however, also been caught on wiretap, planning to exploit her mental health history by acting unstable. She boasted of paying a mental health worker to testify for her. In court, she argued that she had worked for Junior in fear and that Kevin Allen, or K-Rock, was her pimp, and that she had been dealing drugs to support her habit. But the wiretap showed that despite her disabilities, Tina Fly ran things and ran people, so much so that the FBI had named the entire task force after her, Operation Flytrap. Operation Flytrap began in 2001 at a picnic table behind LAPD's Newton Division Station on Central Avenue during a conversation between Officer Mark Brooks of the LAPD and Special Agent Robert King. And I'll just interrupt myself to say that one of the things that I came to the conclusion about during the course of the research was how important it was to tell the different sides of this tale from the multiple perspectives of the players. So that it turns out that what is interesting about my book is not that it's about gangs or drugs or the drug trade, but that it's about cops too. Those voices were actually much more challenging for me to get, and for me to gain even permission to speak to law enforcement was incredibly difficult, and it was much more challenging than speaking to gang members or drug dealers. So I'm actually very lucky that I got to do that. For a time, it didn't look like it was going to be a possibility. So I'm pretty grateful to actually, especially the 2 law enforcement people at the center of this case. Yeah, and then the other thing that's fun is, in my cell phone, I have to mark that as, I have the FBI guy, the LAPD guy, I've got, I've got all the targets, I'm emailing with people. It's like you develop a new community that's really holistic in some sense, and I think that's actually the sign, like if our society could do that, I mean, it's more like Venice. Like my cell phone is like Venice, I feel like. Okay. So continuing right along, Special Agent King was in LA on another case, and the 2 had previously met during the takedown of 38th Street, the historic Latino gang neighborhood of Sleepy Lagoon fame. Brooks proposed that he and King work together against gangs in 2 nearby Bloods neighborhoods, the Pueblo Bishops, and the Bloodstone Villains. Gunfire intended for a gang member had recently killed an innocent woman on her porch. Brooks's lieutenant was pressuring area officers for results. Brooks had been around a long time and knew everyone in the neighborhoods he patrolled. He had watched the kids grow into gang members of the most lethal kind, violent and on drugs, uneducated and lacking in empathy. He had started his own childhood in a similar neighborhood, but his mother had moved from Watts and Compton to Texas. There he had chosen a different path and made it, something he liked to remind the young G's of when he encountered them on the street. He knew, he said, that the neighborhood was full of good people, but it was his job to get the others, like these gang members, who spread poison in the community. Brooks and King began to lay the groundwork for a new task force to draw out that poison permanently, if possible. The Pueblo Bishops and Bloodstone Villains, two adjacent African-American Bloods neighborhoods, hold down the 50s blocks between Central Avenue and Alameda Street in Los Angeles. The relationship between the Pueblos and Villains is often contentious, but historically, they had been close allies who'd never engaged in a full-scale gang war. Rumors abounded that members of the other gang had AIDS. There were squabbles over all kinds of neighborhood issues. 30 years of love, friendship, partying, and rivalry came out in all kinds of crazy ways that didn't necessarily lead to lethal violence. The two allied gangs used to write their names together, PBSV for Pueblo Bishops, Bloodstone Villains. By 2000, however, tensions between the two neighborhoods had increased. Pressure from nearby Crip gangs had kept the two Bloods neighborhoods united, but the gradual dissolution of the Blood-Crip ideological rivalry, beginning in 1992, and the demographic shift in the area from Black to Latino, sparked chronic fighting within the two gangs, as well as with 38th Street, the Latino gang just to the north of them. The Operation Flytrap Task Force intended to stop this warfare by targeting the area's lucrative underground drug economy and its key players. Jenia Jackson watched it all happen from a distance. "That ride," she said later, "I'll never forget that ride. From the morning officers had burst into her house to the day in court where she heard the wiretap recordings of her daughter's voice talking about drugs and fake paperwork. Over the year following the arrest, Ms. Jackson dropped 10 pounds from her already slender frame and had to be hospitalized. Her other daughter began suffering from chronic headaches, for which she also required hospitalization. To make things worse, Tina's 2-year-old grandson had internalized emotions of raised hands and spread-eagled legs and would respond automatically to cues for secure entrance into the Federal Metropolitan Detention Center in downtown Los Angeles, where Tina was being held. That broke her heart most, Ms. Jackson said. At 2 years old, that little boy already knew how to go to jail. Jenia Jackson had lived on 56th Street for 30 years. She remembered when the first Mexican family had moved into the neighborhood. Her own black family was now one of the last on the block. Miss Jackson was known to her neighbors as a firm person. She frequently called the police on the kids in the neighborhood, and she opened her garage to them when they had problems to discuss. She worked hard for her church and organized Women's Days activities and worship events. She had been a block captain and was devastated by Officer Brooks' targeting of her family. "Why mines?" she demanded. "Why not these?" she asked, pointing to the cadre of girls on the corner who continued to deal drugs in the wake of the task force. She had until then been so proud of Tina, knowing that Tina was finally living on her own, that she had cleaned herself up from her addictions, that she was no longer running around on the streets, that she was paying her own rent and managing her own household. The drug game, however, was what had inspired Tina to get clean, and it kept her afloat. It was her new addiction, she said, fast money. Neither the most powerful nor the least, Tina was at the center of everything. She was the one always calling, the one always coming or going. She connected everyone from the highest to the lowest. She was everywhere, all the time. Painstakingly, Brooks and King built their case. They recruited confidential sources, they stationed themselves in undercover vehicles, and made strategic arrests. But their informants were too scared to give good information, and their undercover cars were always identified. After the task force won the right to wiretap cell phone communications, all of this became moot. Brooks and King now knew everything about everybody, who was dating whom, who was fighting, and who was selling, and for how much.
The drug verbiage of chickens, birds, bricks, cookies, ones, twos, and fives became the language of their everyday world. Within a 2-year period, they had successfully uncovered the network. They assembled a list of 28 names, obtained warrants, and gathered the resources of over 30 collaborating law enforcement agencies. Then at dawn, on June 26, 2003, they started breaking down doors. Okay, so that's as much as I'm going to read. That little first section is kind of like a microcosm of the whole book, in that it touches on all of these key things. It touches on the relationship of mental illness to incarceration, for example. It touches on the use of confidential informants and on what snitching does to neighborhoods. It touches on the changing nature of gang violence given the changing nature of the city around us. It touches on federal, it doesn't touch as much on federal sentencing policy. I guess I should say that Tina eventually received a 25-year sentence for her involvement in the drug conspiracy. Junior, who was somewhat above her in the conspiracy, received the longest sentence, which was 27 years. The major drug supplier, who's sort of a little bit later in the book, received a 22-year sentence. Now, federal sentencing policy is extremely complicated, and if there are policy implications to this book, it has to do with federal sentencing policy. Recently, in 2010, there was the Fair Sentencing Act that Obama signed into law. Before that, there had been this 100-to-1 crack versus cocaine sentencing disparity, meaning you had to have 100 times the amount of powder to trigger the same mandatory minimum sentences at the federal level. Now that's been semi-rectified to just 18-to-1, which is still a pretty significant disparity. However, there are ways that people are not gaining access. That law has also been made retroactive, okay? This is what we call justice, right? It means it applies to people who got sentenced before under the old laws, but it doesn't apply to Tina, okay? It does not apply to Tina Fly because she was labeled a career criminal, and career criminals are not eligible. So the thing that I am thinking about right now is this link between mental illness and access to justice, and the notion that even the Bureau of Justice Statistics knows and understands and has written reports about the fact that mentally ill people are overrepresented in our jails and prisons, and they do tend to be chronically involved in the illegal economy. And if that's the case, there are probably a lot of people out there who are being denied this basic access to justice based on sentencing. So if there is a policy direction that I'm headed in, it's that. There are a lot of things that I'm interested in terms of reform. There are a lot of stories in here. There's a lot of stories about confidential informants and snitching and giving information, and the kind of pressure and the kind of distrust that foments in communities, and how absolutely harmful those kinds of policing tactics are to communities, because if you don't have a community that trusts each other, you have a serious breakdown in social control. And the mistake with current policing is that they think that they can do social control from the top down, and they can't. What you need are strong lateral networks, but in societies that have actually, in parts of town that have actually been forsaken by a lot of the benefits of the current political economy, of our educational system, you have the development of horizontal networks that are actually threatening, like gangs. They support people in other ways, and so it's really complicated for law enforcement to really work its way around that. And this story is about that tension. And so that's really, through storytelling, me wanting to really change the rhythm of the conversation. Just using this one case. There are a lot of people who write stories about criminal justice right now, and what they do is they'll pick and choose like the worst cases, like the most egregious examples of like law enforcement corruption, they just pick and choose from wherever they are. But I happen to know this one guy who got caught in this sweep, and I wanted to just look at one case, a case when everybody was good. The cops were good, they weren't corrupt. They were working hard. They believed in what they were doing. And in a case where, the drug dealers are likable people. Everybody's a human in this story, and nobody's a hero and nobody's a villain. And I think that that kind of everyday nature of this case, it's nothing exceptional, is really the true way that law works to create inequality in our society. It's studying the everyday and non-exceptional cases, I think, that get you there, and that's really what I'm interested in. So anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.